Warning, some viewers may find this content disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. People in the US military, what's the creepiest/most paranormal thing you have encountered during your service? US Navy photographer here. In the deepest parts of the ocean, you'll often steam past small boats that are empty or seemingly empty. Sometimes they look like they got loose and no one looked for them. Sometimes they look disgusting, like someone lived in them until they couldn't. Sometimes it's obvious someone is still in them but they haven't moved for weeks. Creepy at first. Ended in a face bomb. I was a young sergeant in 2006 stationed at Fort Bliss. Right outside of Fort Bliss was a training area that was near Biggs Airfield. We were guarding some equipment overnight so the company wouldn't have to stay. Warning, some viewers may find this content disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. People in the US military, what's the creepiest/most paranormal thing you have encountered during your service? US Navy photographer here. In the deepest parts of the ocean, you'll often steam past small boats that are empty or seemingly empty. Sometimes they look like they got loose and no one looked for them. Sometimes they look disgusting, like someone lived in them until they couldn't. Sometimes it's obvious someone is still in them but they haven't moved for weeks. Creepy at first. Ended in a face bomb. I was a young sergeant in 2006 stationed at Fort Bliss. Right outside of Fort Bliss was a training area that was near Biggs Airfield. We were guarding some equipment overnight so the company wouldn't have to stay. It was me and one private. I told him he would take shifts patrolling, and since we were allowed to have cars out there, the other would nap in his car. I woke up to my soldier knocking on my window in a complete panic. It scared me at first. Private: Sergeant, wake up, there's UFOs out here. Me: what? Private points in the direction, and sure as shit I see these lights that seemed like they were floating around and then disappearing. Took me a moment as I had just woken up. That's the Franklin Mountain Range. You're looking at the cars driving on the scenic route. The cars would be visible and then disappear when they went around the corner of a turn, only to appear again when they came back around. I was very agitated at first, but the next day it was by far the funniest experience I had in the military. I was working the night shift in an old SIF that was originally built back in the 50s. I was starting to feel sleepy, so I went for a walk to wake myself up and ended up getting lost in the maze of underground tunnels, finding myself in a part of the complex that obviously hadn't been used in decades. Everything looked like it was just left there and forgotten one day, eerily frozen in time. I was extremely tired and stressed out from work, and that really didn't help me to be able to rationally retrace my steps. Everything around me seemed like something was hiding in the shadows and watching me. It took a long time, but I finally made it back to my position and didn't tell anyone what happened. Luckily it was the night shift and no one noticed I was gone. A year later we got a new guy, and in the middle of the night shift he got up and went for a walk. A couple of hours later he came back looking like he'd seen a ghost. I just gave him a knowing nod, and he knew I knew exactly what he just went through. As a Marine, I used to have the graveyard patrol shift at the Beirut Bombing Memorial. Part of the memorial is dedicated to a veteran cemetery. Oddly enough, I never got freaked out being completely alone in a remote cemetery, in the middle of the night, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. It was actually kind of peaceful, to be honest. However, one night I was patrolling near the perimeter fence where some of the oldest headstones are, when I heard the sound of a woman humming. I followed the sound and noticed a light glowing through the vines and brush of a large tree. As I approached, I could literally feel my hair beginning to lift as if there was an electric current in the air. I pushed aside the brush and what I saw nearly took my breath away. It was an old, weathered headstone with a large cross etched into the marble. Only the cross was glowing a bright, vivid blue, like a neon bulb. The humming was also suddenly much louder and had a weird plurality to it, like it was coming from hundreds of voices at once. Needless to say, I freaked the fuck out. I screamed like a scared little girl and sprinted back to the parking lot. I radioed the guard who was supposed to relieve me and forced him to come early, then spent the rest of my shift in the cab of his truck. I don't think he believed me, but he stayed in his truck and didn't go out on patrol until the sun was fully up. A few days later, I worked up the nerve to return to the grave, during the day, of course. As I suspected, in the light of day it was a completely mundane headstone. There was no name, only the aforementioned cross. I ran my hands over the stone and checked to see if maybe there was some sort of hidden light source or solar panel, but no, it was just plain, solid, unremarkable stone. The humming was gone, too. I eventually returned to my normal shift, but never again experienced anything out of the ordinary. I never learned whose grave that was, either, but I find myself thinking about it from time to time. It certainly sounds absurd when I say it out loud, and I suppose it could have been a hallucination or a trick of my tired brain, but I don't believe it was. I think it was real, a ghost or spirit of some sort, but I don't think it was malevolent at all. We wrote it off as some of the instructors messing with us, but while training at JWTC, there was a blood-curdling scream in the middle of the night. Definitely sounded like a woman. The lieutenant in charge made us do a quick accountability check, then he started radioing the training center to see what the hell happened. The instructors went out from their compound, did some checks but didn't find anything. They said it's not the first time they had units out there calling in to report the same thing. Is a dude vanishing spooky enough? I was on one rooftop on post with another Marine, and on the building next to mine was a dude smoking a cigarette. I looked to my partner to mention it, but when we looked again he was gone. The roof access door for that building was very rusty and loud, so there's no way he snuck out in those few seconds it took to get my partner's attention. I was by myself in the engine room of a submarine on the midwatch, just a newly reported sailor trying to find equipment so I could display knowledge to one of the watchstanders. There are a number of bays in engine room lower level with narrow passages that pass through the center. I came down one of the ladders, and I swore I saw someone walk across the ship about 15 feet in front of me. I could hear his footsteps as he walked around a corner and out of sight. 3 problems. 1. He was wearing utilities, an older, light blue blouse and dark navy slacks. Nobody had utilities anymore. They had been phased out 3 years earlier. 2. There was only one other person awake in the engine room that late at night, and he was standing at the top of the ladder behind me, waiting for me to come back up with an answer to his question. 3. He wasn't actually there. I wrote it off as sleep deprivation, but I'll admit it shook me for a while. Fast forward to 4 months later, I had gone out to sea with another submarine of the same type. While I was there, I met a sailor who had previously served on my ship. After a few weeks of standing watch with him, he told me a story of a sailor who had committed suicide while on watch when he served on my ship almost a decade earlier. In engine room lower level. In his utilities. I wish I could have gotten a picture of the look on my face. I'm sure it was the definition of disbelief. One time at an Air Force base in the Rock we had a power outage at night. All of us walked out of our hangar doors to take a see what the problem may have been, and we saw a very, very large triangular shape passing over our hangar. It was a clear moonless night previously, and when we went outside to look around we noticed the starscape being covered then slowly uncovered. No sound associated with the event other than normal sounds of the location. I'll never forget. Used to be F-22 avionics for the USAF, 2A3x2, no shred. At an undisclosed base, a light appeared above the flight line moving in odd ways and hovering. We called it into our number 1 and he called other AMUs to ensure there were no sorties being flown that we didn't know about. Shortly after, F-22s and 16s were scrambled and could not intercept the object. It disappeared into the night. We saw this go down from our flight line. Shortly after, we were informed that this never happened. My dad's stories. He served in the Taiwanese Marines as a drill sergeant. Much of the ground in Taiwan saw violence under occupation, and it was rumored his base was built on or near a mass grave. Needless to say, he's had a few paranormal stories. He had a guy report to him in the morning exhausted but frazzled. The night before, he had been on guard duty, overlooking the firing range. The targets on the range were a mix of clay and wood figures, cut and drawn to look like an enemy soldier aiming a rifle at you. According to the guard, when he'd been bored out of his mind staring out over the range, he saw clear as day one of the clay soldiers wearily lay down his rifle and exclaim, "Damn, I'm tired." The guard said he passed out from fright. During the evening, when training was over, the sergeants for the most part had the time to themselves. My dad liked to go snake hunting during dusk, when the heat was rising from the ground and the snakes came out of their holes. So one evening he sets out, carrying a bag, a nice long stick, and a flashlight. As he was making his way across the field, zigzagging in a search pattern, he found himself getting closer and closer to an old, decrepit outhouse that had been abandoned as it was too far from the main base. As he got within a few yards of it, he was hit with a sudden feeling of apprehension. Something told him going near the outhouse was a bad idea. At that moment, his flashlight, aimed right at the construct, went out. He fiddled with the battery, smacked it, thought fuck, better get a new battery, and turned around to head back. The moment he turned and faced the main base, the flashlight flickered back on. Great, time to keep hunting. The moment he turned to face the outhouse, it flickered off again. Faced the base, it flickered on. He did this 2 or 3 times, got the message, verbally apologized for intruding, turned and walked calmly back to base. The base itself was surrounded by forest and mountains, the natural terrain of Taiwan. One day a soldier was reported missing. As the day went on, it was clear that he'd either deserted or was in serious trouble. A manhunt/rescue team was organized and most of the base was out searching for the guy as the rain started to come in. As night fell, they called it off, and got ready to try again tomorrow. They found him in the morning, huddled in a wet, dark cave, scared speechless and out of his mind. No one was sure what he saw to cause him to freak out, and they never found out. They shipped the guy out soon afterwards. Finally, one of his years on the base, it was hit with a huge typhoon. Typhoons are pretty regular in Taiwan, especially during the summer, but this one was going to set records. Everyone hunkered down and reinforced the base as best they could, and it held well, and after days of relentless rain and wind, they emerged to survey the damage. One of the trees on base had been hundreds of years old. It sat on a hill and overlooked the base, and so had been the site of a Buddhist shrine set at its roots. Now the roots twisted and turned into the air. The storm had torn the tree from the ground. And yet, the shrine itself was untouched. Even the red silk covering, with nothing weighing it down, hadn't moved an inch despite the winds that had finally torn the great tree from its hill after hundreds of years. The soldiers took this as a sign that despite whatever would be thrown against them, their spirit would remain strong and unmoved. Submariner here. There are few things as unnerving as wondering about the engine room from 2330 to 530 alone on watch. When the boat is largely shut down in port, it becomes a very quiet place. The roving watches usually make it an hourly game to speed through their log rounds, especially in the lower levels. One particular in port period, the boat was moored in Pearl Harbor and a few people started complaining about a real uneasy feeling. I was on the mid-watch as the SEO on evening and a senior chief came back to do his required 0300 tour. We saw him walk past maneuvering on his way to Shaft Alley. This particular senior chief was the crusty old salt type, and would usually spend a bit of time just sitting in the lower levels of the engine room alone and contemplate life, so we expected as much. What we didn't expect was him to literally run into the maneuvering area a few minutes later. The man was pale-faced, and breathing heavily. We sat up straight, our eyes as wide as his, thinking we were about to have to announce and fight some ship casualty. He slumps into the Edo chair. A few tense, and silent, moments go by. We're on pins and needles. He finally opens his mouth and tells us about the fucking ghost in Shaft Alley. Swears a sailor passes by him as he's sitting on a trash can in Shaft Alley. His first response was to call out to the guy, see who it was. But then he realized this guy isn't dressed right. He describes what this guy was wearing, the old World War II naval uniforms. So he quickly gets up to catch up to the guy, and he does. Catches up to him all the way aft. The guy turns towards the senior chief. Looks right at him. Then turns away and literally walks through ass end of the boat. It's now that the senior chief decides it's time to leave Shaft Alley, and promptly does so. Swears up and down that he knows what he saw. I sure as hell wasn't about to leave maneuvering that night to find out for myself. One of my drill sergeants actually has a creepy story from one of his Afghanistan deployments. He was infantry, so being in the field and out of missions for multiple weeks wasn't uncommon. One night while sleeping in a fighting position he felt something nibbling at his feet. He woke up and kicked it off, and what he saw wasn't any type of marsupial but a little humanoid figure he could only describe as looking just like Gollum. But being in the field with little sleep, he chalked it up to just seeing things. A couple days later he and another guy in on watch, and the other guy pointed out something and said, "What the fuck is that?" and pointed at a stone wall in the distance. My drill sergeant looked through his binoculars, and crawling across the top of this stone wall was the exact little humanoid creature he encountered a few nights before. I worked in Arlington National Cemetery while I was in the Army. The tomb guards always talked about seeing or just hearing soldiers marching some nights. We were cataloging graves one night when I thought I saw a soldier in my team up ahead, so I called him over. He answered from behind me. When I looked back, the other soldier was gone. I am a skeptic and I believe everything paranormal has a real-world explanation, but I'm still trying to figure that one out. I saw a UFO when I was in basic training at Fort Lee Norwood. I was walking from one building to another to start my fire watch shift when I noticed something as bright as a star make a zigzagging pattern at impossible speeds and then disappear over the horizon. I had never been more clear-headed and sober in my life, so I'm sure I saw something. So I'm currently stationed on an aircraft carrier commissioned in '77. There is never a lack of creepiness on that thing at night. I work security on it at night, and we rotate from nights to days every so often. I remember one night my buddy was heading up to the flight deck with a rifle from where our armory is, first deck, Up to the flight deck, 04 level, which is a 5-story difference. It's a lot of distance to travel alone at night. So he gets to a certain part of the boat that's almost pitch black, once one from the flight deck, and he hears these footsteps behind him. He looks back and no one is there. So he picks up the pace, and as he does he hears the same footsteps. He looks back and this time he sees a dark figure about 30 feet behind him. At this point his fuck that switch turns on and he starts briskly jogging. He then hears the footsteps also pick up the pace and run after him. He dead sprints up the last flight of stairs up to the flight deck, and hustles over to where we are on the front of the ship. He's white as a ghost and tells us what happens. We stay away from that area of the ship now. Other than that, down on the 7th deck of the ship, second to last deck before you hit the hull, there are munitions storage areas, basically where we keep our bombs for planes. Well, back in the day a little girl falls down one of the ladder wells, which is legit a 6-story drop to the bottom. She ended up dying. There are chains and various other items that can be moved,